My name is Deborah Pearlstein. I'm a visiting research scholar here at Princeton this year. And the reason I think I was asked to make this introduction, which I'm very excited about, is because circuitously, Gary Motsek and I came to be at the same meeting here at Princeton several months ago on the question of what to do and what challenges existed surrounding the use of private security contractors by the military in Iraq and elsewhere. My background is, number one, in constitutional law, and number two, in human rights. And before coming to Princeton, I directed the law and security program at Human Rights First, an NGO in New York. Now, I give this introduction of myself in the service of giving an introduction of Gary Motsek to explain, I think, in part, what a great partnership, I suppose, incipient partnership anyway, an opportunity it's been to get to know him in these early days as Princeton moves forward with some work on what to do about the challenges of security contractors. Gary Motsek is Assistant Deputy Undersecretary of Defense and is in that capacity the principal advisor to the Office of the Secretary of Defense leadership on policy, in particular policy related to developing and maintaining a framework and support governing logistical and support operations, including combat, humanitarian, and disaster relief operations. You know, what does all that mean? That means, I think, principally, and you can correct me if this is wrong, that he's one of the guys really on the front lines for the Department of Defense in figuring out how to manage the challenge of having on the order of 160,000 contractors, give or take, currently deployed on behalf of the United States overseas. Over the course of his really distinguished government career, he's won numerous civilian service awards, Army awards, including the National Defense Service Medal. But it's really in his current capacity that I just described that's put him in front of dealing with, really in a day-to-day way, including tomorrow, on this question of the management of private security contractors. The number of private military contractors in Iraq right now, and I'm not going to spend much time talking about this, is on the order of, I think, 150,000. You can correct me if that's wrong. But it's the role, really, of the security contractors, those carrying weapons, engaged in protection and detention operations and more, that have posed the greatest challenges on issues of who's in control on the ground and what consequences flow if existing rules are violated. And it was really on these issues that I met Gary last June here at Princeton, where he joined a pretty amazing group of government experts, academic experts, and experts from the contracting industry, including people with a lot of on-the-ground experience, in trying to figure out what should be done. And we ended up issuing publicly, and you can find this on the Woodrow Wilson School website, a short consensus report. There was a remarkable degree of consensus, I think, released in that off-the-record meeting and what was a pretty frank exchange. So we'll hope we can talk a little bit on the record about some of these issues now. Gary Motsek is now leading the team working on developing a memorandum of understanding between the Department of Defense and the Department of State on personnel security contractors. So he is really in a position to tell us what's going on behind the scenes about the headlines we see day to day. We're especially grateful that between trips to Iraq and Afghanistan, not to mention Europe and as far as everywhere else, he's been able to put Princeton back on his itinerary. So thank you.
I always get intimidated when I come here because in 1970 you accepted me as a deferred applicant. So you wouldn't let me come in September. You said I could come in January if I behaved myself. So I said, to hell with you, I went to Syracuse. But that's neither here nor there. Good news is it only took me 3 hours and 15 minutes to get in my car. It was 3 hours and 15 minutes of pure silence. BlackBerry didn't go off very often. And to leave that 25 square miles of insanity that's surrounded by the rest of this nation is really nice every once in a while to get out and get away from Washington, because there is a profound difference. Well, I found that there is a profound difference. Things are magnified in Washington to such an extent that sometimes you really wonder what is real and what's not real, what's important and what's not important. So it's kind of exciting. I hold the record of being held in a GO report for not doing my job before I was ever offered my job. So I have some experience with the General Accounting Office and the bureaucracy of government. I was very pleased about that because there was nowhere to go but up. And so we went on from there. So we're going to talk about contractors. We'll get to security contractors as we go through this process. We're going to talk about why we are where we are. Lots of questions, lots and lots of questions. Why are there contractors in the area of operations? We call it a contingency operation. People call it a war zone. People call it a variety of different things. But by law, what we have in Iraq and Afghanistan today are declared contingency operations. And that has a connotation because, for example, it means DOD contractors, which is what I represent and work with, are subject to the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act, which means they can be prosecuted for high crimes, basically felonies of that are U.S. violations, even though they're overseas. So we have having it a declared contingency is very, very important in that respect. But it's important to put things in context. We have always had contractors with the Armed Forces of the United States. Kit Carson was a contractor. He was a contractor. Buffalo Bill Cody was a contractor. In the early parts of World War II, the CBs, the construction battalions, before they were made construction battalions formally as part of the Department of Navy, were contractors. The Flying Tigers in Taiwan, or excuse me, in China during World War II, they were contractors. We've always had them there. We could have I'm not a lawyer. That's good news. But let me assure you, the use of contractors are legal. There's a very technical definition about what happens in Afghanistan and Iraq. We call it a war, but from the rules of war, the rules of land warfare, the international rules of land warfare, it isn't a war. So the use of contractors is legal. Things changed, though, for the U.S. military forces post-Cold War. If you all remember, some of you are too young to remember, but we remember that there was a demand for a post-Cold War dividend. When the wall came down, we thought peace was going to run rampant throughout the world. There was a demand for us to have a post-Cold War dividend. And raw numbers, the U.S. military, particularly the Army, was reduced substantially by as much as 40%. The Army had 18 divisions in 1991, and they were directed to go down to 10 divisions. So that gives you an order of magnitude of what they were told to do. However, they were also told at the same time, for example, I want you to take risk in the support side of the house, not in the combat side of the house. In other words, keep the pointy end of the spear sharp. So even though they reduced in manpower the equivalent of 8 divisions, from a combat power standpoint, they reduced by about 3 divisions by transforming and putting people into the combat arms. And we made this decision that we would take risk in the support services. We would have less military truck drivers. We would have less ammunition handlers. We weren't going to cook our food anymore. We would have very limited movement of petroleum by ourselves. We would not run our own base camps. So we keep the guys on the tanks, we keep the guys on the aircraft, we keep the guys on the aircraft carrier, and we're going to take risk on the other side of the house with the support services. On paper, this makes sense. On paper, this makes sense because you as a taxpayer have to invest in the military member, and you invest in that military member whether you use him or not. The skills for a combat arms person, the fighter, if you will, are pretty severe, pretty stringent. You've got to keep those guys intact. You've got to keep them motivated. You've got to keep them as a cohesive unit. And you're going to pay his salary, his benefits, and then his retirement. And so the trade-off was, maybe we won't do that with all the truck drivers. We'll take risks, and we'll hire truck drivers as necessary to augment the small organic capability that we kept in place. We also saw that there were some selected, increasingly sophisticated technologies that it just didn't make sense for us to start training in-house and consistently and constantly have the turnover of military members or government employees managing those and maintaining those systems. Some of your satellite communication systems, some of the aviation systems are purely contractual logistical supported. And from a financial standpoint, that actually makes sense. There was also an attempt, both in this administration and the last administration, to go through privatization through A76. It's an A76 process. A76 refers to an Office of Management and Budget brochure. And for a government employee, it is something that's a kiss of death in their mind. Because what it is, it's an analysis and to see whether or not your particular work area can be done more efficiently or effectively with contractors as opposed to government employees. And there's a trade-off. The bottom line is that if with the civilian side of the house, the contractor side of the house can do it for 11% or less, your jobs get commercialized. And so that was going on at the same time everything else was going on. And all of our planning for potential conflicts around the world, we made some assumptions which may not have been true. Certainly didn't hold true in Iraq. And that is, we thought we had limited duration of operations. So we would field a force, we would have to fight a war, we would have to do some other work in a constabulary nature, but basically a year and a half would be out of the operation. So there was a willingness to take risk again, to use contractors, because there was a short duration assumed. There was certainly some life cycle savings to be had. I go back to that truck driver over and over again. If I have a truck driver that I have to hire, I hire that truck driver at whatever price, but only for the period of time that I'm going to use him. I may use him for a year, I may use him for 18 months. If I have a military member who's that truck driver, I have all his benefits package, but because of our policy, we have a 1-to-3 ratio of personnel on the shelf in case we have contingency operations. In other words, the intent of the government, the military, is that we have a rotational policy for every person that is in the war zone. There are 2 people in the rear. One is already returned, and one is preparing to go. So in theory, you would not have to go any more than once every 3 years into a war zone if you're on the active force. One in either 5 or 6 years, whether you're in the Reserve or National Guard. So there's that rotational policy. So the trade-off is not a 1-for-1. It's literally a 1-for-3. So when you get into these discussions about what a guy's getting paid as a contractor in Iraq versus the government military guy, from a pure raw number standpoint, not from that individual standpoint, but from the pure raw number standpoint, you almost got to compare a 3-to-1 ratio of the entire benefits package to come off with it. The other challenge that we have is that we keep consistently redefine what is inherently governmental. By law, we cannot contract out inherently governmental functions. Cannot. There are some things that are very clearly inherently governmental. To take offensive military operations is inherently governmental. The military must do that. In contracting officers who represent the U.S. government must be government employees, either military or civilian. In the pay area, in the comptroller side of the house, certain functions must be done by a government official. And some of those are very, very clear as to what's governmental, inherently governmental, and what is not. But there's a lot of stuff in the margins that, depending on how you cast the system, how you cast the discussion, can fall in or out of inherently governmental. And that's where you get the challenge, and that's how you start ending up with people making decisions, people making assumptions, and pulling this together in a composite, and you start ending up with some pretty significant numbers of contractors when you start adding up the numbers. So that's been a challenge. On top of all this happening, at the same time, I told you 1991 is when we started taking these big force reductions. We also made another assumption as a nation, and that is the U.S. military would never have these huge contracts anymore, so the big acquisition workforce that we had could be cut substantially. And it was cut by roughly a third. It was always short. If you talk to the acquisition community in those days, and these are the guys that buy the weapon systems, these are the guys who do the contracts for services, they've always said they were overstretched to begin with. But we made a conscious decision as a nation to chop about a third of them off the workforce, because we did not perceive we would have these large contracts anymore, and that we'd have a very measured acquisition program and sustainment program. So where are we on this present environment that we're in today? Because this is reality. Instead of a short-term operation, we are looking at 2 substantially extended operations, 5.5 years. We've had expanded roles and missions. If you told the Department of Defense that we would, quote, be a nation building or anything related to that, you can use any terminology you would like. If you told us in 2003 we would be doing that, if you told us in 2003 that the Secretary of Defense would be worried as much about electrical lines in Iraq as he is about force protection, people would have looked at you very, very strange. But we are, in fact, doing that today. We have long lines of communication. The Chief of Staff of the Army, the old Chief of Staff, Eric Shinseki, whose name is fairly well known, when he became Chief of Staff, this was back in the 90s, late 90s, put a map of Afghanistan up on his wall in his office. And people used to ask why, because this is before anything happened in Afghanistan. And his response was, that is the place, as far as I can tell, it is the most remotest place where we could have operations and it would be nearly impossible to sustain. That was the tough job. No one anticipated that he was clairvoyant and we would be there later on. We also made assumptions that our lines of communication, that's a technical term to hide the facts from the general public, but a line of communication is a road from a port to a unit. It is an airlock, a line of communications for airlines. We assumed they would all be secure. So our admin folks, our supply folks, would be unimpeded going up and down the roads of wherever we were after the initial conflict was over. Clearly, that has not happened in both theaters. So when you have problems and you have to solve them, you got 3 sources to do it with, because people are going to be your solution one way or the other. You can use the military, which is capped, which is sized by Congress, not easily expandable. The U.S. Army and the Marine Corps have now been authorizing expansion, for example, but it's going to take years for them to expand, about 55,000 and 30,000 respectively. You can use government employees. You can use government employees, but by and large they have to be volunteers. There's only very selected career fields where you sign up front for worldwide deployment. So you've got a challenge there, and you have contractors. Now I can tell you there are great success stories in the government employee side. We had depot maintenance folks who had retired in their 70s, come out of the woodwork to come back when these conflicts began. And we had people in their late 60s deploy, every bit as capable as everyone else. But the bulk of the solution set is sitting in the contractor side of the house. So now we're in this environment, we're in conflict. We're trying to limit the exposure of our people in the conflict. So we're talking about 100,000 contractors in a particular area, and we make the assumption that we can handle contracting and the management of these people remotely. We don't want to put our contracting folks in harm's way unnecessarily. So we made an assumption early on that we could do most of that remotely. We could do it from the United States, we could do it out of Europe, we could do it from down in Kuwait. We didn't have to put people inside Iraq. We didn't have to put people inside of Afghanistan. Now this isn't sexy stuff, but it's just plain basic knowledge at this point. You can't do it that way. You got to have people on the ground. If you've got a company that's running diving facilities and it's a multi-million-dollar operation, They're doing a great job feeding your folks and feeding your troops downrange. But you got to have someone other than themselves grading their report card. You got to have the representative, the contracting officer on site to make sure things are going well. So you've heard in the news about all the contractual challenges that they've had in Southwest Asia. The bulk of those are early on in this force, and early on in this operation, when we did not have people on the ground watching what was going on. We were trying to do it remotely. Did not work out. So we have this external contractor oversight challenge. Quite frankly, we didn't have adequate numbers. I told you we had about a third cut of the force, and a good example is in the Army, 3% of the contractual management workforce is military that we can compel to go into the battle zone. 97% of it's civilian, and we cannot compel a single one of those people. We can take volunteers, but we can't compel them. But that's the force structure that we had established. We have different rules, and we did not train our people. We have different rules in peacetime and in contingencies. We are able to waive a variety of different regulations, a variety of different things, because the most important thing is get the support downrange, and our folks were not trained in the contingency operations parts, the contingency contracting piece that they should have been able to exercise. There are, in fact, authorities, executive authorities still on the books that this nation has that could be invoked if we chose to even simplify things greater, but we've chosen not to do that in the executive orders that have come out of the president right now. So I talked about the size of the workforce. Again, the environment is extremely tough. Those, you heard of the recent discussions at the State Department where they thought they were going to have to mandate about 50 or so Foreign Service officers into Baghdad involuntarily because State Department employees, Foreign Service officers do in fact sign an agreement for worldwide deployment. They do in fact sign that, but it's a very difficult thing to make that jump to tell a civilian that we're going to send you involuntarily. So we continue to have this challenge about having substantial, adequate numbers of trained people to do that. Contingency contracting is what we use early on. We're supposed to use contingency contracting early on. Those are the famous LOGCAP contracts. It's the KBR contracts that you've heard so much about. Those contracts are in fact competed. If you've heard talks about they're not competed. They are competed early on, but they're executed via task order. The contractor has won the award, and then he gets task orders for a variety of different tasks to do. Those are not competed. He's already won the contract. Our challenge is to make sure what he thinks it's going to cost is what we think it's going to cost, so we get a fair price for it. And we have not done a very good job keeping good cost estimators inside the government either. So we had this challenge as well. We always want to eventually change over to sustainment contracts. Those are the normal big contracts that you're all familiar with that normally drop the price fairly substantially. And we have not transitioned very well from contingency to sustainment because no one knew the real duration of this. If you go back and look at the news articles since 2004, we're going to be there one more year. We're going to be there one more year. We're going to be there one more year. So we never made the bold move wholesale to go from contingency to sustainment. The last challenge that we continue to have it today is that our funding flow is very fragmented out of Congress. We cannot execute a contract. I cannot have any contract signed unless I have the money already in the bank to obligate against that contract. I can't do it piecemeal. If it's an annual contract, I have to have all this money up front. When Congress gives us incremental funding, when we're on a continuing resolution like we are today, we've got contracts we want to execute today that are sustainment contracts that will reduce the price of something by 10 or 15%. But we don't have the money, so we have to extend the contingency contract, which is a premium contract, until those dollars come into place. Very frustrating. So where do we stand right now? Now these are July numbers. I'll give you some updates on them as we go through. What we do is every quarter we get a census from Afghanistan and Iraq with regards to contractors in battle space, and we update them. But in July, we had 137,000 DOD contractors in Iraq. That number will probably be around 145,000 right now. What we're finding is that our contractors are tracking about 90% of our active force that's in Iraq. So you count the military guys, and about 2 months later, they'll track up to that number. So the number's trailing, but that's what we have in place. Of those 137,000, about 7,000 are private security contractors, about 5%. Those are the guys getting all the news and stories. Now, out of that 7,000, only about 1,500 to 1,600 are the personal security contractors, the ones that you see with the weapons and the hard cars that are running around the battle space. U.S. citizens make up 16% of the contract population in Iraq. 16%. Half of the contract population in Iraq is Iraqi. Half. And that has continued to grow. And there is a conscious effort to do that, to get them employed as well. Again, PSCs only make up 85% of the contractors. 80% of the contractors that we own in DOD provide base support operations. They run our installations. They do our housekeeping. They feed us. They house us, and they move us while we're in theater. In Afghanistan, we've got about 30,000 military, almost a one-for-one exchange of contractors with U.S. military. It gets a little skewed in Afghanistan because we have the Air Force, ISAF in there as well. So the numbers, it's difficult to count U.S. folks directly, independently. They've got a total of about 1,500 security contractors in the area, and 98% of the security contractors in Afghanistan uniquely are local nationals. Rather unique situation. We spent about $16 billion doing all this in fiscal year 07, which ended September 30th. Did we actually spend $16 billion? I don't know. We haven't closed the books. And it takes a long time to close books. Those same contracting shortages I talked about before, we can't declare victory until we put all the bills together and find out what's going on. You'll hear stories that a contractor was overpaid $100 million. That does not mean he got $100 million profit. That may mean that we improperly gave him $100 million more on the anticipated cost. And now that we're going through the bills, we have to start adding up all the vouchers. He's only entitled to a certain percentage profit based on his contract, and money has to come back our way. But it's a very difficult process to do that. Extremely laborious. We are not even done with all the 2005 contracts. It literally takes years to do that, particularly when we're short the people to do it, to be blunt about it. Let's talk about security contractors, because that's the one that's the most interesting in the sense that it's in the news as much as it has been. We are constantly hear reporters and people talking about the rules of engagement. Rules of engagement, which is fundamental, when you can shoot and when you can't shoot. It's important for you to understand that our contractor personnel have no rules of engagement. They are not allowed to use rules of engagement. They have something different. It's called rules for the use of force. And it's a very graduated level of what they're supposed to do when they have to defend themselves. Rules of the use of force are not offensive in nature. That's the key consideration. Contractors are not allowed to go into offensive operations. They can only have defensive operations. Now, from your standpoint, from my standpoint, if I'm standing there, it's very difficult to be able to discern the difference between that, because in your minds and in my mind, a private security contractor is supposed to look like the guy down at the shopping center. At most, he's supposed to have a sidearm, and normally he only has a stick. In this environment, you have private security contractors that are authorized out of a list that's either authorized by the Department of State or the Department of Defense, a variety of weapons which are far bigger than that. Machine guns, grenade launchers. So it's substantially different than just a sidearm environment that we're talking about. But again, The key is they cannot conduct offensive operations. In fact, when they are attacked, their mission is to leave the area. I'm a package when I go over there. I get to go into a Chevy Blazer, which is a hard car. It's got the 3-inch glass in the windows, in the steel. It's a steel box. If we get attacked, their job is to get the package and everyone else away from that area. They are not to engage and do an assault, if you will. They will fire back based upon the rules of force, graduated use of force, and nothing prohibits anyone from defending themselves in self-defense. So when you have a threat coming at you, there are rules, graduated steps that you have to take, but if the gun is in your face or you're taking fire immediately, you are, in fact, permitted to return fire. There have been differences between state rules of use of force and our rules of force, and we're working very diligently to make sure they end up being the exact same thing, a common set while we're in there, because there's this escalatory process that's supposed to occur, and you can see what else they do. Again, got to tell you over and over again, they're defensive in nature. They're not offensive in nature. In fact, they sign a document, among other things, that they are prohibited from going to any offensive operation or use any rule of engagement while they're contracted there. We talked about accountability of contractors. That's another area. I can only talk about DoD contractors. We have the bulk of them. I told you we have about 145,000 now in theater. We'll now know the exact number later on this month. There's probably about another 30,000 contractors that are U.S. government paid for inside Iraq, working for U.S. aid, State Department, other agencies of the federal government, the Justice Department, Homeland Security, a whole bunch of them. But we have a wide range of authorities to manage our contractors. I will tell you up front that the contracting officer authority, this lower left-hand box, is what we use 90% of the time. The contract itself provides for a lot of provisions, and the bottom line is if you're a problem child as a contractor, you're probably only a problem child once, and you're released from theater. You're thrown out. I can only talk to you anecdotally, but if you recall, when Mr. Prince testified in front of the House Committee, he acknowledged, I believe, that 22% of his workforce was sent home before the completion of their tour of duty. We have numbers like that, but you can send them home immediately. So minor infractions, what you and I would call minor infractions, are handled very, very quickly. It's very important to do that because think about where we have our contractors. By and large, we tell them where to eat, we tell them where to sleep, we put a fence around the outside of where they work and live. Any other place, we call that a prison. But this is their work area and their living area while they're in there. So the group dynamics are very important, that if you have frictions, that you need to really take care of them very, very quickly. So the contractor's authority is really the simplest to handle. You drop the guy off the contract, you send him home right away. The commander, our military commanders do have authority. If I was a commander in the field and a contracting person, a person was causing me problems, I can bar him from my installation. You've effectively fired him. He can't come on the installation, he can't sleep, he can't eat where he's supposed to eat. So he has that authority. I talked about major before. For DoD contractors, if it's a contingency operation, they're accompanying the armed forces in the field, that also applies to DoD civilians and our family members. If our family members are accompanying the force in the field, God knows why they would, but if they accompany the force in the field, they are subject to MEJA as well. In fact, there was one case years and years ago where a spouse murdered her husband. The host nation did not prosecute her, and she was prosecuted under MEJA, the Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act, for that crime. Only counts for basically felonies, and it has to be prosecuted through the U.S. federal attorney. Heck of a challenge. You get a choice of 3 attorneys. Get one and pick it up. If the contractor's home the record, you can try to use that attorney. You can use where the contract was signed, or you can use where you bring the person back in if you're going to prosecute them. You must be charged, you must be tried in the United States under MEJA. Lastly, for DOD, and it just came out publicly, it was passed last year, but it wasn't until last month that we actually put a document out, late September. Uniform Code of Military Justice, that which the military falls under, the UCMJ, our contractors are now subject to that in the contingency operation. They can be charged under a variety of articles under the UCMJ. You will not see them charged for failing to salute. You will not see them charged for making disparaging comments, but they can in fact be charged under the Uniform Code of Military Justice and be tried under it for serious violations. And we have some challenges because in some places the same crime appears here, and you have to sort that out with justice as to what you're going to do. But to be blunt about it, the intent is not to convict anyone. The intent is to use that as a deterrence as we go along. The other thing that you need to know, and we need to do a better job telling our own soldiers of that, the security contractors that are running on the battle space, the military has the inherent right, if they observe a violation of the rules of force, rules of use of force, a major contractor a violation, or what they perceive to be criminal behavior, we have the authority to disarm them, hold them, and then the owning agency has to police them up and we can go through the investigation. If there is an action that occurs in theater where a weapon is fired by one of these security contractors, an investigation must be conducted every time it occurs. There's one obviously in the news today, and they're getting a lot of help from places like the FBI, but it has to be conducted. On the military side, again, the DoD side, we have a bit more flexibility because our commanders own the ground, and they have a variety of types of investigations they can initially conduct and make an assessment as to whether or not we need to go forward with an action. So it's a pretty dynamic area and a pretty dynamic challenge that we're operating under. I think this is the last one, so I won't bore you to death. Everything I've told you says what we're supposed to be doing, but I got to be honest with you. When it comes to counting people, I told you we do a manual census on a quarterly basis. It's not a very efficient or effective way of doing it. So this is kind of my chart of what we're trying to do to change the way we do business with regards to contractors. I will tell you, we will not change the existing war fights substantially. We're too ingrained, we're too institutionalized, we're too set in our processes there. But in the future, we certainly will be adhering to these standards, and we intend to push what we can into the two battle spaces that we have right now. The first thing we are doing is that we have an automated tracker system to find out who the heck we got in the battle space that's a contractor. It's all based upon a smart card. I don't even know whether you use them here at school. Does your student ID have a little gold chip in it? Well, you guys are cheap too. Okay, we do. And most of our system is based upon that. That's going to be our contractor's identity paper. His CAT card is his identity paper. That's what goes into the database and shows what his privileges are. For the very best of intentions, we had at least 132 different variants of what medical care was authorized to contractor personnel in the battle space. The intent was we would only provide you, the contractor, emergency medical care. That didn't end up that way. People didn't understand, with the best of intentions, we had a wide variety of people. There were insulin-dependent diabetics, great contractor people, okay? But the value in a battle space when they're in the clinic every 2 days getting the blood sugar adjusted in a battle space with high stress, high tension, caused us some real challenges. So we had to get that together. So the SPOT program tracks you. You swipe when you go to a dining facility. You swipe when you go through a transportation node. You swipe when you're in the clinic. We know where you are. We track for the last 5 days. We're going to go to a newer card, which is a proximity card. You just walk by the thing, and it picks you up. You can run, but you can't hide. Very, very important. We're putting planners in all the Geographic Combatant Commanders. You know, we've divvied up the world with these 4-star commands, and we haven't done a very good job in playing the contractor support. Think about it. 90% of your active force or almost half of your force in Iraq are contractors. You've got this great big op plan for the military side. You've got this itty-bitty package for the contractor side. Something's not right. So we're putting planners in each of the geographical commands to work those issues to make it happen. We're establishing, remember I told you early on we didn't have the leadership in theater to do it. We now put a 2-star in theater. A 2-star officer with a staff, and he manages critical contracts. We're actually at the point today where about half the money that's spent in Iraq are contracts that are actually awarded from inside Iraq proper, not from external sources going in. That's pretty important because then the commander on the ground gets to control what's going on. We're maintaining the policy framework. I own the regulation. That's the regulation I got cited for not implementing when I didn't exist yet. But we own the framework and the policy framework in OSD to make sure these things happen. And we're woefully behind in training. We now have to train our contracting personnel on contingency contracting, like I talked before. We have to train our military people to know how to take care and deal with all these contractors in the battle space. Early on, you can talk to any colonel that was on the ground, and you ask how his contractors did. He'd almost invariably tell you they did a great job, but no one ever told me what I had to do to take care of these guys. It was not part of their training. So we're forcing instructions into the military schools so that we have the baseline established so that they know what's going on and how they're going to do it. I think that is it. So that's the prepared part of it. Then, big numbers that no one ever expected to see. People always ask, well, how many contractors do you have, Desert Shield, Desert Storm? About 9,000. About 9,000. What's important to remember is the support to supported ratio. The World War II veterans around here, if they remember, the support to supported ratio, in other words, for every combat guy you had in the 3rd Infantry Division, or 4th Infantry Division, or an 8th Air Force, depending on whose study you believe, you had 12 to 15 support troops. 12 to 15 for every combat guy. In Vietnam, they claimed it was about a 1 to 6 ratio. In Desert Shield, Desert Storm, it was about 1 to 5. And here, if you add the military support troops on top of the contractors, it's somewhere about 2 to 1. So 1 out of every 3 soldiers, as they would call, is a trigger puller, and the rest of the military and the contractors in the support phase. So the ratio, from a purely numbers standpoint, is very, very favorable. Why does that happen? Technology. I mean, just to maintain a property book, which used to be manual, you had a stack of clerks maintaining a property book. You now have a couple of warrant officers maintaining an entire division's worth of property. You know, so it's a trade-off. Technology has made changes. When I was on the Hill, though, we got beat up because a congressman asked us, in World War II, it didn't take very long to do all this stuff. Why does it take so long now? And you try to explain to people who very best intentions. In World War II, the Federal Acquisition Regulation was measured in inches, okay? Inches of paper and loose-leaf binders. The Federal Acquisition Regulation, which we're filing today, is measured in linear feet. Linear feet. All right, it stands about chogy high. So it's a heck of a challenge, and we keep adding to it every day. So that's kind of where we stand. And of course, if it's not in the FAR, we in DOD have to be special. We call the DFAR, Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation, which supplements it, which is another half a foot or so of regulations on top of the existing regulations. So, questions? Please.
In World War II, and most other wars, when you had these people out there, the soldiers and the support, military, and the quartermasters and whatever, they were counted as soldiers, and we knew how many military people were out there. We had 3 million soldiers. In Iraq, you have 150,000 soldiers because the Congress and everybody was. It's not well known that we have 150,000 others that are basically, you would count them as soldiers if it was any other war, not this war.
Certainly some of them.
We want to keep it hidden.
Yeah, certainly some of them. I would.
Why don't we try to lump them into the fact, the same number as military people, and we could say maybe part of them are civilian, but we have 300,000 people out there.
Well, there's two reasons for it. Number one is, until we started the census, we didn't know how many we had out there. I didn't know about it. When you talk about it, it's an interesting number. It's a relevant number. But when you manage by contract, most of our contracts are performance-based. What's the most important investment you've ever made? What did you invest? It was probably your house.
In dollars?
Yeah, it was probably your house. Did you build a house, or did you buy an existing house? Okay, you built the house. So any given day, you could tell me how many contractors were on site, how many plumbers were there, what day the electrician showed up. And the answer is, of course, you couldn't, because you bought your house based on value and quality, and that's how you try to do contracts. So that sounds interesting, but that's how we manage contracts. So we started counting numbers of people in the battle space that were contractors, because it started to be dragging on us. This is when we found out how many people we had there. But there was never any purpose. No one ever told us we had to start counting them. I am now the counter, okay? You're looking at the counter, and I'm the guy who's responsible for the counts now. And so now we know. The other piece of it is the second piece of it, and that's, I can only talk about it because it's a political issue. It's not my issue. But if you listen to the rhetoric, it's all around what we call the green suitor, the number of soldiers in the battle space. That's the rhetoric that you hear. That's not for me to decide whether that's appropriate or not, but that's the discussion that you hear all the time. So that's what you have. The fact of the matter is, as we exist today, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force cannot prosecute in a sustained campaign without a large number of contractors. Since the downsizing, they've reshifted things around. That's the way it is. I would argue that we never had the proper debate. I talked about the inherently governmental part. We never had the proper debate about, okay, even if it's not inherently governmental, what's the core capabilities we need to keep in the active force or the civilian side of the house? It's interesting to know that, for example, all your ammunition inspectors that you have out there, that certify ammunition that's good to go, it's bad, it's got to be fixed, they're fundamentally civilians. And there are a small cadre inside the Department of Defense that do sign a worldwide deployment order when they come on board as a young 19-year-old, 20-year-old, 21 or 22-year-old. They get some benefits by doing that, but they're subject to worldwide deployment, and then every 5 years, even in peacetime, they're moved throughout the world because we've got them in some really crummy places, and so they rotate them around. But that's a career field that's doing that. I got to do the same thing with contracting people. I told you about the 97% civilians that the Army had, for example. We've got to come up with a cadre of deployable civilians that can be deployed and act as contingency contractors worldwide. I don't think we have any choice. That's fundamentally what the Army's analysis did in the Gansler Commission that just came out last week. There was no surprises in the Gansler report to me whatsoever. But you're absolutely right. It's really, you've got a shadow organization out there. Sir.
I was going to say, make an observation. Perhaps the system, all things considered, works well. It's just the minority of instances that go wrong, given the nature of the theater of operations, that tends to tarnish that. But as a system, it seems that it works not seamlessly, but fairly well.
If you measure what we do on effectiveness, you're absolutely right. If you measure for effectiveness, there's never been a major failure. Yes, there are days the water distribution did not operate properly. There are days that the dine facility is limited in their selections because convoys got delayed or whatever. But by and large, we have not had any mission failures because of our contractual support, even in the environments that they're operating in. But the other half of that is, at some point in time, effectiveness and efficiency have to be weighed, and as things go on longer and longer, efficiencies become more and more important, and that's what you really got to work at.
Sorry, by the way, thank you for your lecture today. As we're moving towards, I mean, if you could say that part of the solution to a number of the problems that we're facing right now is moving towards sustainable contracts. or longer-term contracts? We know that we're getting into longer-term engagements. This is a question that came up with the nationalization of intelligence lecture that came actually earlier last month. The question became, why would you consider that this still be a private enterprise? Why would you still consider these people to be private contractors instead of having the government actually buy out their contracts and make them officially either part of the military?
I would tell you the simple answer, but there's an answer.
The question is clear.
I can give you a global response, but each career or specialized area has its own separate response. But the global answer is the reason why we opt for contracts is because we can shed, we can size, we can expand very, very rapidly, we can contract very, very rapidly when this is all over. And you can shed that requirement. You are not holding on to. If I bring you into the government workforce as a military member, I'm assuming you're going to be there for 20 years. And the retention rates are extraordinarily high. And not only are you going to be there 20 years, but I'm going to pay your pension until you die. If you are a contractor, I may be paying you $85,000, $90,000 to drive a truck, but I may pay you after 2 years, and then I'm divorced of that responsibility. So from a fiscal standpoint, that's what happens. That's great in theory. Okay, but what you got to be careful about is as long as something happens, the trade-off between a contractor and the cost of the contractor and the cost of the permanent guy ends up being fairly substantial. When the State Department testified on the Hill about the Blackwater incident, there was this big issue about, Blackwater never admitted it, but if you remember, they kind of fudged around that their guys were getting around $200,000 a year to be in the battle space. And that was kind of egregious, and everyone got all excited until the State Department official noted that for them to move a DSS, which is a government official who does the same thing in the State Department, with all the trades that they have to do with him, it's the equivalent of about $400,000 a year because of all the pay offsets that he has, the fact that he's still going to be around. So from a purely raw standpoint, it was actually a 2-for-1. Now, that does not mean that the State Department, no government guy gets $200,000, but his entire package over a period of time equated out to that while he was in the battle space. So that's kind of the trades that you got to do. But there's other parts of this that make it very, very difficult to explain. We talked about the truck driver before, right? We civilianized the truck driver. But remember, we assumed that the truck driver was going to be driving in what kind of environment? A permissive, a secure environment. What do we have? A non-permissive environment, right? So, in 2003, 2004, what did we have to do? We had the commercial truck driver, and guess what we had in the right seat? A soldier with a weapon, because the truck driver has no weapon. So we had 2 guys in the truck instead of 1. So, in the short term, yeah, if it was a soldier, he defends himself. He carries his weapon with him. Of course, you have your outriding vehicles as well. So, again, we made the assumption of permissive environment, secure environment for our lines of communication. That's not how it turned out. So, the devil's in the details and stuff happens. We also did not assume, I told you about all the personal security contractors out there. We've also got several thousand contractors and DoD civilians that are authorized to carry a sidearm. Nothing more than a sidearm. But they have to qualify and use the same rules of use of force as a contractor do. But that's for personal security. But they're floating out there as well. And that's trying to mitigate what we just talked about. So if I went over there, if they were really desperate, they could issue me a 9mm. They'd have to be very desperate at this time.
So just one short follow-up. So is a bigger problem the commitment length and expanse, that the commitment itself, the military commitment, could be changing or could be different from what you expect? Or is it, you mentioned earlier, the reason why we got into this is because of technology turnover?
Well, technology is just a piece of it. It was the downsizing and where we had to take risk. We decided to take risk on for the Army guys understand what combat service support is. And that's the answer. It's the quartermaster guys, it's the ordnance guys. That's where we took risk. We would not take risks with the infantry guy, the artillery guy, and the armor guy, or the cavalry officer, or the aviation guy that's flying the Apaches. We would not take risks there. So we took the cut at the other end so we can augment with these contractual plugs. And for the Army, that was LawCap. That was the KBR contract. Before that, it was a Bonnecorp contract. Before that, I think it was a Lockheed Martin contract. And now, the intent is to have multiple contracts to choose from. So three contractors actually won the competition several months ago. It's under protest by one of the contractors who lost. So Congress directed that we don't have the single monolithic contract. If for no other reason, it's the appearances of it is pretty egregious, as I think we all recognize now, that it all seems to be all funneling into one place. We are going to have challenges, though, because in some selected areas, we're all competing for the same people. There are some skill sets that now we're going to have three contractors competing for the same person. So we risk actually driving the cost up of some contractors. Sir?
In the combat zone, are all contractors subject to the UCMJ or just DOD contractors?
Only DOD contractors as we sit here today. Yes, sir.
State Department
No.
contractor?
No. And DOD contractors are subject to both MEJA and UCMJ. It's subject to both of them. Again,
How do combat commanders feel about that?
probably the combat commander wanted it. Again, it's been on the books since last September, October. It's a very difficult decision on how to execute that. Authorities have to be withheld at a very high level for the UCMJ because we know there's going to be test cases. I mean, we did have a court case I think in the 50s that fell through for a variety of reasons. So the one thing I've learned in my job is you get more lawyer help than you ever want to have, whether you want it or not. And they all think you're their client. And I have yet to get the same answer from a variety of them. So, there is truth that you can shop around and get the answer you want, but you got to be real careful about it. Sir.
When you have all these nationals, do you have any way of verifying if they're on your side? Do you have any way to?
Yeah, it's in fact, there's and it's getting better every day. I will say early on it's a challenge, but we actually have a biometric program. If you're an Iraqi that works for us, we got you are identified via your biometrics because of that very reason. There's a lot of reasons for that. We do it. If you go through the police academy, go through the military training, you get biometrically identified. Heck, it's so bad. You heard stories about loss of the weapons. Now when we issue an Iraqi soldier his AK-47, we biometrically tag him to that weapon. So you can't go down to the bazaar and sell it off and get an old one and say, you gave me a piece of garbage here, now give me another one. So biometrics are a very important part of it. And we've got a pretty sophisticated system now that we can track around. What I didn't say is this, the CAT card that I use for most contractors, that's mostly for the U.S. coalition and some third country nationals. Virtually all the local nationals will be using a very cheap card that tags against their biometrics, their biometric data, because all we have to do is prove who they are when they come in. But it's very, very important because the same biometric base is used if they round someone up. It's kind of egregious if you had someone go through the police academy 6 months ago, you find them at the other end doing something else. Well, now you have a tagline against them, so you can do something about it. Sir.
Will most of the Iraqi national contractor positions turn into full-time jobs when this is all said and done?
Some of them will. Some of them will. For example, we've got pieces of their depot up and running. Ideally that will keep running from now on. It was interesting, a comment in Afghanistan when I was there, one of the general officers there made a comment that he would rather see 10 Iraqis digging a ditch than one U.S. contractor with a backhoe doing it, because there was value to that. There was value to that. I'm not in the nation-building business, so I don't want to talk about the State Department or USA, but I would suggest that they would tell you anytime you give someone healthy employment, they can feed their family, they can do those things, they have a sense of worth, that's goodness for the stabilization of the nation. I mean, I can't argue with that. It makes sense to me. But so when we started the census, we were about 35% of the workforce was Iraqi, and now it's actually in July the actual number is 51%, and I suspect it'll probably be about 55. We'll get the numbers in for next week or the week after. So I'm sorry. Love the tie, by the way.
What do you plan to do to prevent future Blackwater-type massacres?
Well, the simple answer ain't my problem because it's State Department. Yeah, it's the State Department. When the Blackwater incident occurred, the Deputy Secretary published a pretty extensive direction to the field, which has caused a lot of work for me. He went back and said, we need to make sure, essentially, that our house is in order. Because there are contract clauses that are supposed to be in their contracts that prescribe what they do. There are training requirements they have to meet. There are standards of conduct they have to comport themselves with. There's a myriad of things they have to do. And he said, you will go back and you will check to ensure that, number one, we are doing all of these things. Number two, you will come back and give me recommendations if you think something needs to be tightened up. And number three, by the way, this is the first time he announced we are going to use UCMJ, because it was sitting on the books as a legal authority and no official pronouncement had been made, and that was part of that letter. So we have been going through that process very, 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 very difficult. The key goes back to the rules of the use of force. That is the absolute key to what's going on. And if they are adhered to, you will still, it's not a panacea. Don't misunderstand me. You have to be over there. You have to have seen a suicide car bomber come at you, all right? A suicide car bomber exhibits a behavior when he comes at you. And when you have a vehicle with several hundred pounds of explosives in it, it doesn't have to get real, real close to kill you. So when you have a vehicle out there exhibiting this behavior, and you're a PSD guy, you start taking the steps. But your only real safety net is distance. And so regretfully, you will still have incidents. I am sure you will still have incidents. You will follow all the rules explicitly, and you will still have a vehicle that is not a car bomber, for example, but exhibited the behavior that did not respond for whatever reason to a variety of escalatory functions, and you'll end up having a challenge. I find it, I would say, how is it possible that you could not see a flare hit your car? That's one of the escalatory steps. A red flare is fired at your car. But if you drive into the sun, into the west in the evening, I suspect you and I would be in the same boat that person might be in. You've got a dirty windshield the whole 9 yards. So you do what you can. But I'm going to blunt about you. In my humble opinion, you'll never avoid it all. I mean, it is still a dangerous place. I mean, I get nervous sometimes, to be blunt about it. You're driving down there and you see something coming at you. You get extraordinarily nervous because you've seen what's happened before. It happens. But it's a following the rules of the use of force. That's an ongoing investigation. It's not DOD, so I can't comment on it. But I mean, in general, that's what you got to have. You got to follow them pretty damn explicitly. A U.S. military member has far more latitude in what he can do than one of these contractors. If you look at the rules, they're published, by the way. They're on the web. You can pick them up.
Two questions. First, very quickly, the control contingency concept, is that defined by DOD or is that a congressional? The control contingency as opposed to
contingency operation, you mean?
Right.
It is a legal definition. It's codified in law.
By DOD?
Only two people can declare the contingency operation, the President or the Secretary of Defense. Okay?
The real question I have, though...
there are other parameters, too. You have to have a force in the field and a couple of other things as well.
But it's an executive department.
Yeah.
The other question I have involves this whole series of things about the use of force. And if I understood you correctly, a overwhelming majority of the contractors on the ground are nationals as opposed to American citizens.
Correct. 16% of the workforce in Iraq are U.S. nationals.
The question that I have is that does the UCMJ...
Oh, interesting question. Yes, interesting question. The answer, both NEJA and UCMJ. The UCMJ and NEJA apply to U.S. citizens, third-party nationals, but the host nation reserves the right to prosecute their people.
That was my question. If, in fact, the host nation refuses extradition, then I assume that is there a chain of command responsibility in which the contractor, the higher-up contractor, can be charged with the conduct of, for lack of a better term,
There's a civil issue, then there's a criminal issue. Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, so but my understanding is a contractor cannot, a corporation cannot be charged with a crime like that. An individual can, but the person cannot. But for a local national, there is no extradition. He's in his host nation.
Right.
It's a passing of the action to the local. Actually, it's not even a passing of the action because the host nation has the authority, and they choose to prosecute or not. It's the gray area, which we always talk about, is a non-DOD contractor in Iraq, a non-DOD contractor, but a U.S. government contractor in Iraq that's not a local national. That's the guy that's in the gray zone.
I understand that the host country can prosecute. However, if the host country...
A host nation, a host country, Iraq in particular, can prosecute their own people.
If they refuse to prosecute, does jurisdiction then...
No.
That person then is free...
If there's an assault in Iraq, and one of our contractors assaults someone, assaults an American, we can apprehend the person, detain him, we must turn him over to the Iraqis. The Iraqis make the decision about the prosecution or whether or not he's free or clear. By the way, that's no different than Germany, by the way. It's the same thing in Germany, as an aside. But they own their people, I guess is the best way of putting it.
But the American superior of that nation in the contract chain could be held responsible.
There could be a responsibility piece, yes, but you're not going to see the contractor be held criminally for that conduct. I don't see that. I'll be honest with you. I do not see that, or the local national, unless he was engaged personally. There was some nexus between. Sir.
I'm curious, with the large amount of contractors that we have, how can we be sure in future conflicts that we have to actually engage in, that we can count on them to support combat troops in terms of an ongoing operation?
If they aren't afforded certain protections, I don't think we can. Both legal protections and physical protections. From a theoretical standpoint of what's available out there, because you do surveys of the service industries, the capacity is there. The capacity is there, and clearly we pay for it to go there, and we pay a fairly substantial hunk of change to do it in a battle space like we do. So from a theoretical capacity, you have the capability, but there are some other issues: protection and legal protections.
So then, from a operational planning point of view, when a combat commander is creating an op plan, and they're saying we're going to need 60 days to get in the country, we're going to have full-on combat operations. However, we don't think the contractor is going to be able to pull the convoy in, so we better pull it off the shelf. Is that going to preclude conflicts and hinder the ability of the president to send troops into the theater?
I don't know yet, because as I told you, I was sending those joint planners out there to do more definitized planning. Because up to this point, much of it is what we call TBD, to be determined, and we haven't gotten to that detail. Clearly, a certain number of days of any operation, big operation, small operation, doesn't matter, a certain number of those days, you principally do not operate with contractors. There's always exceptions. There are some contractors that are coming to force no matter what, but they're onesies and twosies. But there's some transition period of time, be it 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, where we stop supporting ourselves with our organic capability. The Marine Corps prides themselves, first 30 days they're covered. They will cover themselves for 30 days. On day 31, they better either be the Army or a contractor to plug into, where there's a challenge. And so the planning process sets that up. The LOGCAP contracts, which are the bulk of the ground force contracts, go into pretty excruciating detail as to what goes on, who comes in when, what they bring with them. Heck of a big challenge, what you have to buy. There are lead times for things that drive. I mean, if you have to buy material handling equipment, big container, rough terrain container handlers, that may drive your contract capability. They can't come in until 8 months later. If it takes them 6 or 7 months to get a delivery, and you have to build them from scratch. Some generators are like that. You know, sometimes the Corps of Engineers goes in with their contractors to put power in a particular location. Some of those power capabilities are unique to that location, and they have to build them from scratch. And it takes time. Yeah, it's not a switch, though, turn on and off, sir.
Given that the contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan are subject to many of the same dangers, basically, as our combat troops, is there any obligation on the part of the U.S. government towards their care and welfare where they killed or injured? And if not, does this represent passing on that cost?
It's interesting. That question gets asked quite a bit, even on the Hill. DOD is required to follow a Department of Labor rule that requires that it's fundamentally a comprehensive health insurance policy that you take out on people, so that you do not burden the family, and they're forced to do that. That includes all primary and subcontractors, by the way. So that it goes back to that Blackwater guy. A huge amount of his remuneration is his insurance contract, which is both a life insurance contract and a health insurance contract. But they're required by law to put that in place. We only intend, as DOD, to provide emergency medical care, stabilization, and evacuation capabilities. We do that for our contractors, and then the normal civilian system has to pick it up on the other side based upon their contractual relations. Some companies choose to have a comprehensive policy. There's a couple ways to skin the cat, but you have to have that in place or you're not allowed to compete. Sir?
I mean, clearly described that this whole business of using so many more contractors is a profound shift in the way that the military does things, and presumably the main motivation for that is basically money, try to save money. And the question is, and you also described how a lot of the assumptions on which this shift was based turned out to be wrong. So the question is, did it end up saving money in practice? I mean, does it cost more or less, do you think?
I would tell you that it's hard to say. My gut assessment is we haven't reached the crossover point yet, because on some examples I use, you have to have a guy at least 8 years before he approximates the life cycle of the single person. So you haven't crossed over that piece. The other challenge that you have, which I didn't allude to, was you got to get, even if you decide you're going to put it in the force structure, you got to guess right. What if we decided that we're not going to contract out interpreters? We've got to have them in-house. All right? And we looked around the world and said, North Korea looks really bad. Okay? So we need 6,000 Korean interpreters. Well, we would have guessed wrong, and we would have the glory of having 6,000 contractors, 6,000 interpreters on the payroll today when we don't need them. We could have guessed properly back in 1991 or 92 or 93, maybe we need 2,000 Farsi interpreters in the force structure, and let's keep them inside the military force structure or the civilian government force structure, and we would have guessed right. Before the Cold War came down, we had lots of Russian interpreters, Yagavaru Paruski. It doesn't serve me real well, okay, right now. Okay, it doesn't serve, unless I want to get inside the Russian mafia. It doesn't serve me real well. But, so there's a guessing mode, there's an assumption mode, so that's another part of the equation that we kind of blew by when we talked about it earlier. Sir?
Yeah, what kind of negative impact does it on retention of mid-career soldiers, 8 to 10 years of service that will get out because they can see making 2 or 3 times a month?
That was early on. I would tell you that both DOD and quite frankly, law enforcement was very concerned about that early on, because there was a rush, 2003, 2004, to fill the ranks. It's one of these situations, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. We pride ourselves in asking you to come to join the armed forces because you're going to serve your country, and what else are we going to do? We're going to give him skills that he can use later on in his life. Okay? That's what we're telling you, right? And then what do we do? Or what could potentially we do? At his 8th year mark, he suddenly sees it. His skills, which we offered him, that's why he came in, are now worth $200,000 over here, and we're going to bitch because he's blind? We offered him that from day one. But there, yeah, from a statistical standpoint, from a physically running the force standpoint, in those years there was some real concern. SEALs, Special Forces, Rangers, because the bulk of the PSD contract people were all former military or law enforcement. Had a lot of SWAT team guys in there. So, you were drawing off the LA SWAT, New York SWAT, and things of that nature. So, that kind of became plus, those are the type of guys that go for that kind of stuff, I guess. I don't know. I used to think about bombs when I was in the Army. I was crazy. It wasn't suicidal, but it was self-destructive, according to psychologists. It was interesting. Ma'am?
Last question.
Aren't you lucky? You better be good. Pressure's on.
Oh,
think about it.
I pass.
No.
You mentioned in response to this question that one of the reasons why we can't hire interpreters full-time as government employees is because we can't estimate accurately how many interpreters would be in the future. Now, there's flexibility built into the civil service system, however, assuming that the authorities are not all regular. There's resident authorities, substitute authorities, and inland authorities, and these are temporary positions. So why is it that we can't hire these contractors as temporary government employees as opposed to regular government employees?
It actually depends upon the skill set. First of all, let me step back. The same issues about putting in the military apply to the civil service. You're guessing that you need this many people. And it goes back to what I call that core thing. I don't think we'll ever get the number right. I think what the argument is, we don't simply divorce ourselves of Farsi interpreters or Chinese interpreters, but we decide that there's a core number. It may not be the full requirement. It may be 1/5 of the requirement, 1/4 of the requirement, but that gets you going, if you will. And we haven't had that debate in my mind to make those judgment calls. We do, in fact, hire people as temporary government employees, but it really depends upon what's going on. It's interesting. A lot of interpreters are individual contractors. That's what they choose to be. They choose to be an independent, single contractor. They own the contract. They are their person because they generally feel they provide that flexibility. But we do bring on temporary civil servants to do that function. Again, it's finding them right now. We can't generate the proper number of interpreters if we wanted to right now. We just don't train enough of them. We don't have the baseline to train them. And it goes back to the question that was asked earlier. You actually, early on you start taking risk. You start taking risk because you have a good interpreter and you haven't vetted him properly, and you can end up with some challenges. So as time has gone on, the vetting of the interpreters have gotten much, much better. My son has had several tours over there, and his best friend on both Afghan and the Iraqi side has always been his interpreter. That has always been the person that he kind of bonded with because they were together, and they turned out to be a good pair. So that was a good question, unfortunately.
Thank you so much.
Okay.